class. So we'll go ahead and get started with a topographic map review. So recall what a topographic map is and what it shows. So on a topographic map, we have these contour lines, which are the brown lines you see here. And these lines have your elevation written down on them, and they're separated by secondary contour lines that don't have any elevation written on them. However, on the map, you should be able to find the contour interval to understand which elevation point each line is. You can also figure that out by taking the two primary contour lines elevation and doing some quick math to figure out what the elevation of each secondary contour line is as well. Right, so remember, some important features on a map are the scale, north arrow, and different types of coordinate system. So in scale sense, for example, we have 1 to 2000 scale ratio, and that's written in a ratio format, which is also the same as 1 over 2000. So what that means is if you measure 1 unit in map scale, and you were to go into that place in real life, that would be 2000 units in real life. North arrow is pretty common on the map, and that's usually located on the bottom or bottom right corner. However, it varies from map maker to map maker. Recall that we looked at two different types of coordinate systems. We looked at township and range, and we also looked at latitude and longitude. So in the important features of the topographic map, once again, we have our north arrow, and we have a true north and magnetic north. For the most part, when you're looking at a map, you're referring to true north. And then when you're out in the field with a compass, then you would be looking at magnetic north and doing a correction to get true north. We have our contour interval, so in this case we have a contour interval of 20 feet. We also have our scale here, and it tells us that our scale is 1 to 24,000. So 1 inch on the map will equal to 24,000 inches in real life. At the same time, 1 feet on this map, if you have enough space to measure a foot, will equate to 24,000 feet in real life. So for example, if we take a measurement and we line up that measurement with the scale, we can see that that line is exactly half a mile. Right? And if we use the scale portion, and let's assume that the red line that we measured on the map is 1 inch, we can say that it represents 24,000 inches in real life. Alright, so township and range. Recall that the notation of writing this is from smallest to largest. Right. So in township and range, recall that we have the baseline, we have the principal meridian, and townships run horizontally, where the township is going to be the same value going horizontal, and then the range is going to be the same value going vertical. So going further away from the baseline, we have increasing values in the township. Going further away from the principal meridian, we have increasing values of the range. To the top of the baseline, we have township represented with north. To the south, to the bottom of the baseline, we have township represented with south. The right of the principal meridian is east, left is west. So where we have our township and range that intersect, we have a congressional township that is broken out into 36 individual sections. Do note the notation of how the sections are numbered, as we start from 1 on the upper right and we move left, counting upwards, and it kind of snakes its way down to the bottom until we have 36. Right. An entire congressional township is about 6 miles, and which makes one section 1 mile by 1 mile. Right? So to write this out, we would say this square, this particular section, is 36, and we are in Township 2 North, Range 2 East. But a section is still pretty big. It's a mile by a mile. So we further break this down into individual quadrants. So if we look at this square, the red square that is highlighted, that is the northeast quadrant of section 21. And if we look at where it's subdivided again at C, it is the southwest quadrant. So to write this out, we have the southwest quarter of the northeast quarter of section 21 of township 23 south, range 23 west. Right, so we start at the very smallest, where C is in the southwest quarter of the northeast quarter, so that's the slightly bigger red square of section 21, the biggest red square that we have here, and then the township and range. Remember the rules for contour lines, that when you're drawing your contour intervals, your contour lines should never cross with one another, so that means in physical space, in a real space, no longer on paper. That means if contour lines are crossing, we would have a single point in physical space that has 2 elevation values, which is physically impossible. Right? If we're talking about something that's very steep, such as a cliff, these contour lines will get incredibly close to each other, and that would illustrate a very steep region, such as a cliff. We want to draw around our points, and we don't want to connect them. The exception of this is if the contour points that are given are of value or of the same value as the contour interval. So, for an example, as we remember from the week prior to spring break, if we're given these elevation points and we're told to draw contour lines with a contour spacing of 10, we would not want to have something like this, where we have intersecting contour lines and we are connecting the same contour line with all these different values. So remember that a contour line is a line of one single elevation. Instead, we want something that looks more similar to this, where 400 is connected by that contour line. So anywhere on that black outer circle, we have 400 feet of elevation, if we assume that these are all written in feet. On the middle circle, we have an elevation point of 410. So 410 is connected with that contour line. And note that 415, 413 are within the circle, so that means we are increasing our elevation as we're going in towards the center. And then towards the center most, written around 421, we have our 420 elevation contour line. Alright, so now we have our current week's lecture, so rivers and groundwater. And why should we care about rivers and groundwater? So the obvious reason is for resources, because we need water to survive, but also it doesn't really happen that often, but when it does, it makes major headline news, is for hazard and natural hazards, such as floods or the lack of groundwater or groundwater contamination. Right, so the different types of rivers. These are just going to be some quick examples of the different types of rivers that you would encounter. These are just aerial photos. So for the first example here, we have dendritic rivers, and these rivers look pretty much like blood vessels, look very organic, hence the name dendritic. We have meandering rivers with oxbow lakes. So the oxbow lakes are these crescent-like lakes that are left over when the river as the river meanders, it leaves behind these oxbow lakes. So it's kind of the shape of an oxen horn, hence the name oxbow lakes. and we have a braided river. So the braided river looks like a braid, essentially. It's a bunch of small rivers and streams that are winding back and forth, and they connect together to be a braided river. So in a river system, we of course have the source of the river, which is generally somewhere up high. So for example, a glacier or a mountain or groundwater is extruded from the mountain somewhere. And this is gradually collected together into a large amount of water that would flow downhill, down tributaries. Um, they would sometimes connect with one another to have a gaining river, or the river would be branching off into different streams, tributaries, and we would have a losing river. And finally, the river, well, hopefully will end up at the ocean. So we have a cross section of a river here, and we have the primary river channel, and this is where we normally have water flowing. Now, when there's an excess amount of water in the river channel, we go into the flood stage, or water will overflow into the floodplain, and it would basically be the flood stage, and that's where we have more water. Ideally, you don't want to be building on the floodplain, but we still tend to do that from time to time. So humans have developed levees to essentially block the flooding of the river, so we're able to live a little bit closer and live on this floodplain. And when the levees break, we of course have flooding. Okay, so deposition and discharge of the river. In the figure here, we have a meandering river, and on the black portion of the figure, we have erosion, and that sediment that is being eroded will be deposited in the blue section. So it's going to be on the inside of the bend of the river is where we have deposition. On the outside bend of the river, we have erosion. Depth of the channel and shape of the channel will determine the river velocity. Along the river bottom and edges, we have the slowest velocity of water. On the surface of the river and towards the center, we will have the highest velocity. The steeper and deeper side of the channel, we will have higher velocity as well. Right, and how do we measure discharge? Discharge is in units of measurement of volumes per second, where we would calculate the area of a cross-section of the river perpendicular to the flow direction, and we would essentially multiply that area by the velocity of the water to determine the amount of discharge, or how much water is being moved per second. A simple way of doing this is to divide your cross-section of the river into squares. Calculate the area of each individual square or rectangle, add those all up to get a total area, and then multiply that by the velocity of the river to get our discharge. And here we'll have porosity versus permeability. So if you recall from the igneous rock samples class, we had vesicular basalt and pumice, which are rocks that had a lot of pores within it, so it was very airy and sponge-like. Right? So that covers the porosity portion of it. So it looks very airy, has a lot of pores in it. So permeability is something a little bit different. Permeability is how well those open area, those voids are well connected. How easy is it for something to flow through it, such as a liquid? And that is porosity versus permeability. You can have something with high porosity, but it can also be very impermeable. So an example could be such as the vesicular basalt. It does have a lot of pores in it, but it might be relatively difficult to flow water through it because those pores are not interconnected. So some controls on porosity and permeability is the amount of sorting that we would have in terms of if we're looking at sand or gravel or clay or soil type. If we have something with a high amounts of sorting, so something that is well sorted, we will have both high porosity and high permeability. Something that's poorly sorted, so we have different size grains, we start to lose on our porosity and permeability because now we fill the void spaces between the larger grains with smaller pieces. So that restricts the flow of water and also takes up some of that empty space. If we have something that is poorly sorted with a matrix filled, so this would be an example of mixing sand and clay together, we would have clay being packed between the individual grains of sand. So essentially you're reducing the porosity down to almost zero, and the permeability would also be very low because now water has no flow path between the grains. Right. So we'll go ahead and look at water table and aquifers. So the water table is basically the level of water where the hydrostatic force is equal to the atmospheric force. We have three different types of aquifers that are being shown here. We have a bedrock aquifer, a confined aquifer, and an unconfined aquifer. And these are all being separated by aquitards, or a layer that is that has very low permeability. So it's keeping the water in place and reducing the amount of communication between the different aquifers. So in the bedrock aquifer, we have our bedrock that is saturated with water, so all the individual pore spaces and cracks are being filled with water. In a confined aquifer, we have aquifer material, and that could be sand or any type of high porous material that is saturated with water, and same thing for the unconfined aquifer. If we were to drill wells into both the unconfined and confined aquifer, the water level of an unconfined aquifer would give us the water table, of groundwater. Essentially, we'll be able to know the flow direction and how high that groundwater is. In a confined aquifer, that water table will be at the highest point of the confined aquifer, the highest water level point of the confined aquifer. And that's just due to an increasing amount of water pressure as we go further down in the confined aquifer. So if we look at the two wells that are drilled into the confined aquifer, so the well the furthest to the right, that is labeled as flowing artesian well, and the furthest left well that is labeled as non-flowing artesian well, we see that in the flowing artesian well, the surface of that well is below the water table surface of the confined aquifer, or that we see at the recharge zone on the furthest left. So in your lab that you'll be working on, you'll be taking in a lot of data points, and we want to assume a best fit line. So we do this by looking at a kind of eyeballing an average and seeing the trend of the data. Of course, more data will give you a better best fit line. So with a few points, you can still kind of approximate a best fit line. If we look at the individual x's here, we can see that a line is drawn roughly through the middle, through the most dense. And we had some examples of this in the first chapter, Thinking Like a Geologist. In this week's lab, all your instructions will be in your lab book. Go ahead and find the chapter on rivers and groundwater, read through the chapter, answer the questions. I'll go ahead and provide data sets on the lab experiment that would have been done in class. However, for obvious reasons, we can't. That experiment was looking at different soil materials, sediments, and determining a porosity and permeability for these samples. So that data set will be provided for you to complete the rest of the lab.